Hello, this is Bernie Voss and Martin Lanik. Today's webinar on how to coach leadership habits, not just skills, is starting now. The HR Certification Institute has pre-approved this webinar for one general certification credit towards PHR, SPHR, and GPHR recertification. To earn this credit, you must attend 90% of the webinar. Additionally, you must be logged in via your computer in order for the webinar to register you as an attendee. Please email us now if you have any trouble logging in via your computer and instead are joining by phone or wish to get HRCI credits. At the end of this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. In the survey, you can indicate if you wish to receive the activity confirmation number to submit for HRCI recertification credits. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please put your questions into the chat box, and at the end, we'll have 15 minutes to answer questions, but can also answer questions as we go if you submit via the chat box. Martin Lanik founded Pinsight in 2010, and we've worked with several large corporations like Coca-Cola, Denver Health, T-Mobile, Ruby Tuesday, Kia, and we've received recognition from our peers, in particular the Chief Learning Officer in Practice Awards and Brandon Hall Group. We won the Silver Excellence in Learning for best use of simulations in games and learning. Today we'll be covering coaching through the development pipeline, a popular pipeline used for coaches, and how to develop leadership habits, and then combining the two for coaching leaders to develop leader habits. I'm going to share some interesting facts about coaching and introduce a basic framework for coaching known as the development pipeline, created by Peterson and Hicks. So, can you believe that 66% of CEOs don't receive coaching, yet 100% report that they want it? A recent study by the Stanford Center for Leadership Development and Research in 2013 surveyed hundreds of CEOs, and they learned that most CEOs want coaching and they indicate that they need it, and they all indicate that they're interested in receiving it for developmental purposes. The culture has really changed since the early 90s when people kind of thought coaching was a sign of weakness. Now everybody wants a coach. There's a study by Metrics Global with a Fortune 500 firm that found that there was a 529% ROI of coaching. So now we'll get into a little bit about the development pipeline. The coaches ought to be kind of identifying areas where they can free up talent flow. So first, this is presented by Peterson in 2002. The first step is insight, really building that understanding of what needs to be developed in your coachee. The second section of the pipeline is motivation, and really making sure that your coachees are motivated to continue their development. There's a couple parts to this motivation. Kind of the initial insight provides a little bit of motivation, but there are keys to sustaining motivation throughout the coaching relationship. So some of the keys to this, as we'll get into later, is really making sure that the things that you're working on are congruent with their personality. Third, we have capabilities. Basically, it's the coach's job to make sure that their coachees understand the learning process, the development process, so they have all the tools they need to work on their development, and they kind of give them feedback throughout. Fourth, there's real-world practice. Your coachees need the opportunity to focus on their development at work with cues and opportunities to work on their development on the job. We'll be talking about each of these a little bit more down the line. Finally, accountability is essential. If you aren't holding your coachees accountable, then they aren't going to be able to see the results that they really need. So we'll talk about a few different ways to do this. So some of the key questions here would be, Do people internalize their new capabilities to improve performance and results? You need to follow up on learning assignments and personal commitments for actions in this stage. So Martin, could you tell us about the types of behaviors that need to be promoted through this pipeline?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Bernie, for the introduction. So my name is Martin Lanig. I am an industrial organizational psychologist, and I'm the CEO of Insight. Very happy to be here today and talking about how we can help through coaching develop leadership habits instead of just developing skills. Bernie, if you can go back one slide, I just want to highlight that this development pipeline is a very useful tool for coaches. Very good mental model as you're thinking about, where should you direct the discussion or the intervention. So one way to think about coaching and your role as a coach in the relationship with your clients or coachees is you are really structuring different interventions, and you are trying to diagnose through the discussion, where's the person stuck at any point in time. And we know, based on the work of Peterson, that there are these 5 different components necessary for any change in human behavior. And people actually go through these processes in about, this linear fashion. Sometimes they deviate, sometimes they go, back and forth between the different steps. But in general, these are the 5 steps necessary for you to help your coachee achieve change. And then as Bernie highlighted, when the person or your client is stuck in any particular point in this development pipeline, they are not going to change. And your job as a coach is to find, where are they stuck, and then design a specific intervention to help them get unstuck in that particular area. So very useful tool for your coaching practice. Now, when we talk about behavioral change, one of the things that is very very important for us to consider is how is it that people develop habits, and specifically positive leadership habits. When you think about it, most of human behavior on a daily basis is automated. So we don't make conscious decisions because we have we build habits over time. So for instance, you are not standing in your kitchen for 30 minutes trying to decide which cereal to eat for breakfast. You automatically go for a box of your favorite cereal. The same way you don't think about where you put your keys on a daily basis because you have trained yourself to automatically put your keys in the same place so that you actually know where they are and you can find them. So most of our behavior is habitual. And this actually creates or begs the question of how we develop and how we change human behavior. And specifically, we developed this leader habit formula at Insight to help coaches understand and participants understand how to change human behavior in a way that really becomes automatic. So we want to, through practice and through the coaching interventions, we essentially want to help participants to develop a set of habits, a set of positive habits. Now let me back up. So when you think about leadership theory and how we actually got to this notion of helping leaders develop positive habits. So initially the field of leadership started with the great man theory, so suggesting that leaders and great leaders are born, they are not developed. So there is a particular set of factors, personality, characteristics, or whatever you call them, that really determines who is going to be a good leader and who's not going to be a good leader. And these are largely genetically given to us when at birth. So those were the initial theories, and there we were looking at really the emergence of leadership. So the whole field of psychology and leadership was focused on how can you identify the ones who have the right predisposition to become great leaders. So then we start thinking about leadership in terms of behaviors. So we start identifying that there are a particular set of behaviors, particular set of skills that great leaders possess. And that whole movement led to the invention of competencies, and then, of course, all of the leadership training. Because all of a sudden, if you start thinking of leadership as a set of behaviors, you can start training behaviors and you can start training skills. So the whole concept of leadership development or leadership training makes sense, because now it's not something that we are born with, rather it's a set of skills that we acquire through experience and through practice. Now, we are extending at Pinsight, so we've done a lot of research to extend this thinking even further to the next step. That thinking is actually displayed on the next slide. When you start thinking about leadership skills and then automating those leadership skills. So on a daily basis, leaders are confronted with so many different decisions to make. So they cannot consciously be thinking about those skills. And that's the key difference between a skill and a habit. So it's the level to which that behavior is automatic. So the more automatic that behavior is, the easier it is to display, and the more effective that behavior becomes. So the difference between a skill and a habit is that a habit is automated, meaning that it does not require conscious thought. The person doesn't even think about it. So skills are still effortful and they're still conscious. Can we stay on that slide for a bit? Thank you, Bernie. So the way, and actually research in training has shown in cognitive psychology, that the way to turn a skill into a habit is through a process that we call overlearning. So you achieve a skill when you achieve mastery. So once you master certain behavior, it's your skill. But a lot of people stop practicing that skill at that point. What cognitive psychologists have found is that once you start, or if you keep practicing a skill over and over again through a process called overlearning, then it becomes automated and it turns into a habit. So your brain actually works very hard on its efficiency, and it works to preserve any energy waste. And this is the internal process that actually results in automaticity or automation of that behavior. But to get there, the biggest gains in efficiency and in behavior become automatic actually happen after you practice, when you practice a skill after you've mastered it. So at that point, it turns into a habit. And why we care about habits so much, especially in the context of leadership, is that habits do not require any thinking. So they free up cognitive resources for the person. Think about driving. So first, it was effortful. You had to really think about managing the steering wheel, switching gears, the gas pedal, brake, clutch, and so forth. After you practice that, and you practice that over and over, you mastered it, and then you practice briefly beyond mastery, then driving became your habit. And now, when it is a habit, it's completely automatic. So oftentimes, you might get so involved in a conversation with a passenger that you actually miss an exit on the highway. And you completely went on autopilot. The only reason you're able to do that is because you've developed a habit. So this is why habits are so important. They do not require any cognitive resources. So people are able to do these things, these skills, these behaviors automatically without any thinking, so they can concentrate on other things that they are trying to do. And in the context of leadership, there's just so many different skills that leaders use on an everyday basis that you cannot possibly be thinking about every single behavior, every single skill that you do. So the more we can help as coaches turning that skill into behavior, and the more benefit our leaders are going to receive and the more they're going to grow. So now you might be thinking, well, how do you turn a skill, or how do you turn a behavior into a habit? And there is through research, we've been able to identify, very specific formula for changing any behavior into a habit. And the first step is always simplicity. So when you think about a larger leadership competency like delegation, for instance, or strategic thinking, or empowering others, influencing others, whatever that competency is, it is very unlikely that that entire competency is going to turn into habit on its own. So what we need to do is break down that competency into its micro behaviors, and we need to identify the micro behaviors that constitute that competency, and by practicing each one of those behaviors independently, you create a chain, and you create a whole process of you build a competency basically by each micro behavior on its own. So if we go back one slide, so I'll walk you through an example of delegation. Delegating well is a common leadership competency that appears in most leadership competency models. Now, we can define it as assigning complete projects that have a clear beginning and end and fit the employee's skill and interest. So this is how we can define the skill, the competency of delegating well. Now, once you start developing this skill, it's a complex skill. So developing it all at once is not going to result in a habit. But what we can do, as you'll see on the next slide, we can actually break down this complex skill into the individual micro behaviors. So we could ask, what do leaders who delegate well actually do? So first, through our research of about 800 leaders globally, we found that leaders who delegate well first identify what and let the employee determine how to do that. They think about the employee's skill when they are delegating a project or a task, and making sure that the employee is actually equipped with all the necessary skills to get that project done. They also consider the employee's interest. So is the employee interested in this type of work? Are they interested in this project or in this in doing this task? And then, of course, they have a discussion about deliverables and deadlines. So at what point do I expect to receive what with their direct report? So these are the 4 micro behaviors that constitute the complex competency of delegating well. And once we have broken down this competency into these micro behaviors, it's much easier to turn each one of these little behaviors into habits. And you'll see on the next slide that the habit building formula, or how generally people build habits, is very simple. So there are just 3 things that you need. First, you need to have, of course, the behavior, and research has shown that the simpler the behavior, the quicker it will turn into a habit. So hence, when you have a complex leadership competency like delegating well, break it down into the individual behaviors. Then you need a cue. So a cue is something that the person responds to with that micro behavior. So a good cue has to be something that is naturally embedded in the environment and in the context where you expect to see that micro behavior. So when we're talking about delegating well, a good embedded cue would be a point when the participant decides that he or she is going to delegate a project or a task. So now the point of decision serves as a good embedded cue. So it appears in the same context, and it's simple and salient enough that the person can respond to it. Bad cues are generally artificial cues, and this is what oftentimes slows down the habit building process. So if we pick cues that have nothing to do with the behavior, like a phone alarm or a sticky note on your computer, those are going to be helpful in the beginning, but they're not embedded in the same context. So the minute you stop putting your phone alarm in place, or the minute you remove your sticky note from your computer, all of a sudden you have no cue, and hence you cannot respond to that cue with a behavior. And then last, you need a reward, and we'll talk more about the types of rewards. But again, when people design or they're trying to change their behavior, they oftentimes pick a reward that is not effective. They pick an extrinsic reward. So whether it's praise from their friends or colleagues, whether it's money that they pay themselves or put aside, or maybe some kind of a vacation that they promise themselves if they follow through with their plan. So those type of extrinsic rewards are not effective. And research has shown that when people pick extrinsic rewards, they give up fairly quickly. So what's more important is finding an intrinsic reward. An intrinsic reward is something that is intrinsically satisfying, gratifying to the person. And oftentimes, what's intrinsically rewarding to us stems from our natural tendencies. So when you start thinking about micro behaviors as expressions of your coachee's or client's personality, then you can match and you can start aligning the micro behavior with their personality, and hence find a behavior that is in and of itself going to be intrinsically rewarding for the person. The person is going to be getting satisfaction from doing it. An example would be, an introvert learning how to be a public speaker. This is something that is not going to be intrinsically rewarding as a behavior for the introvert. It's going to be much more intrinsically rewarded for an extrovert, and they're going to derive more satisfaction. The introvert is going to struggle more, and they're going to give up in the long run. Now, of course, any kind of habit building requires practice and repetition, and especially it has to be deliberate practice. So whether you have learned how to play a musical instrument or sport or creativity or mindfulness, writing, any of these things require practice and focused practice. So once you identify the micro behavior, you pair it with a cue, and then you just practice this over and over again. Research shows that on average it takes 66 days of practice before that behavior becomes a cue. So one of the jobs when you think about how do you coach to leader habits is really to help your client identify these behaviors that they can practice on a daily basis. And I'll give you a couple examples. So going back to delegating well, one example would be to ask for agreement on deliverables from the employee. That's the micro behavior, and then you associate with a cue. When discussing a project task with an employee, you ask for agreement on deliverables. Okay, so now we have a very simple, very clear 5-minute exercise that the person can do on a daily basis, and it's likely to result in a habit. So again, we have a cue. When discussing a project task with an employee, I'm going to ask for agreement on deliverables. And that's all that's necessary. So through enough practice, this behavior is simple enough, the cue is strong enough, and then through repeated practice of average 66 days, this small exercise is going to turn into a habit. And then once that exercise is done, then you can start working on another exercise. So let's say that now the person wants to improve their strategic thinking, and more specifically, they want to expand the breadth of their perspective. So the competency here is taking strategic perspective. So you as a coach can now help to create a simple 5-minute exercise for the person again. So first, identify a micro behavior. So how do people get this strategic perspective? Well, people who do that and who have a strong strategic broad perspective, first they learn about other parts of the organization or industry that they know little about. So the simple exercise could be for the person to spend 5 minutes every day exploring part of the organization or industry they know little about. So they could search the internet, they could review company or industry report, they could have a quick chat with a colleague. So this is the behavior. And now we associate that behavior with a specific cue. So for instance, salient cue after you start your computer each morning. So it's a very specific embedded cue in the context. First thing when I start my computer, I'm going to spend 5 minutes just exploring a new part of my organization or industry that I know little about. So very simple exercise, and again, through repetition, this is going to result in a habit very quickly. Now, why is it so important to keep it simple? So where most leadership development and coaching efforts fall short is when we try and teach or we try and develop a whole competency at once, or even multiple competencies at once. So people's motivation vary on a day-to-day basis, and the more difficult something is to do, the more motivation it requires for it to cross this habit line. Let's call it a habit line. So in order for something to turn into habit, the person has to practice, and for them to do that behavior, they got to be motivated, highly motivated if the behavior is very difficult to do. So as you'll see here, if you keep the behavior very easy, so seriously something that only takes 5 minutes a day, then the required motivation is very low. So it takes just 5 minutes a day, and even on the days when I'm very tired, fatigued, not motivated at all, it's so simple that I still do it. And that's the key. That's the important part to any behavior change, is that if we keep the habit small enough, easy enough, simple enough, through the person actually will do the practice. And it's that repeated practice, those 66 days, that's all we need on average for the person to repeat this simple exercise in order to turn that into a habit. So this useful model is actually coming from B.J. Fogg, a researcher at Stanford University, and it has been very well received in the research literature. And celebrated, in fact, as a very good model for how to change human behavior. The key is keeping it as simple as possible. Always when you are designing an exercise or homework for your coachee, think about what are they likely to do on days when they have zero motivation or even negative motivation, when they feel really tired. So that's how simple you want to keep that. Now you might be thinking, well, how can these 5-minute exercises actually turn into a whole leadership skill? Well, the thing is that there are these skills. So starting, the 5-minute exercise is a starting point. But once you start on the development journey, all of these behaviors are linked. So, think about how you teach animals complex behaviors. You just break it down and you teach them one little behavior at a time, and then you combine those little behaviors together in the longer chain of behaviors. Same thing with how we teach children to walk. So they take a first step, and then next step, and then 3 steps, and you basically chain the behavior together from these different chunks. So it's the same premise here. You start with one 5-minute exercise, but through repeated practice, you practice that behavior over and over, and then when you master that one behavior and it becomes automatic, you move on to the next micro behavior until you have mastered all of the necessary micro behaviors for that particular leadership competencies. But also there is this concept of Keystone Habit. So once you develop a particular habit, and when you practice that behavior, and you find that one habit, it has the tendency or the power to start a whole chain reaction. We see this oftentimes with health behaviors, like for instance, people who stop smoking. So pretty soon they start working out, and they start eating better. So these are a keystone habit. So it's that one key habit that then basically explodes in personal growth. So for you as a coach, helping your coachee find that keystone habit is really crucial, because then just start this chain reaction, this whole domino effect. And you know, the person thinks that they're just working on this one tiny exercise, 5 minutes a day, but in fact, they are developing at a much greater rate. So how do you find a keystone habit? You know, our research has shown. So we've researched about a couple of years. We've been researching about 800 leaders around the world, and what we found is that all these leadership behaviors are actually linked. So there is a conceptual link between all of these micro behaviors, and that helps, because as you are developing one particular leadership habit, then it can start. The person automatically will start with all these related behaviors as well. So that's one. So the behaviors automatically, once you start working on one habit of one of the micro behaviors, just because of its relationship with all the other micro behaviors, you are likely to see a chain reaction happening. The other one is practicing in multiple contexts. So once you have that 5-minute exercise, that cue behavior, practice it in multiple contexts. So practice it at home, practice it at work, practice it you know, on the plane, in your hotel room, wherever you possibly can, because you are helping your brain to associate that cue and that behavior with multiple other unconscious cues that you're not even aware you're picking up on, the different contexts. And hence the behavior becomes stronger, and it can prime actually other different behaviors just because of the associations. All right, so that's how you develop leadership habits. Now, Bernie, we're going to tie it back now to the development pipeline, so that we can help coaches on this webinar to understand where to direct their intervention and how to even diagnose that somebody is stuck somewhere along that development pipeline.
Exactly. We'll be talking about the development pipeline and kind of how the habit literature and the development pipeline intersect. So leader habits should be flowing through this development pipeline you're seeing here. You know, you have a problem somewhere when your coachee isn't practicing the right micro behavior to make it a habit. So the common symptom throughout this entire pipeline is no practicing. So there are a few little things that get added into each section of the pipeline that can help you diagnose which section you need to be paying attention to, whether it's motivation or real-world practice or capabilities.
Yeah, so this goes back to the idea I mentioned about earlier on this webinar. So when you think about the role of a coach, you know, your predominant responsibility is really creating interventions that help the person change behavior. I'll repeat that because it's such a critical concept. So you as a coach, you are responsible for creating small interventions during your coaching session that actually helps to change human behavior of your client. Now, in order to do that, you need some kind of a framework to know where to focus that intervention, and then based on this information, the intervention is going to look differently, right? So the development pipeline, think of it as a framework, a mental model that you have and that you're referring to during the coaching session, and you're trying to identify where's this person stuck? Where should I focus my energy and my intervention today? Where should I focus the discussion? Is it on insight? Is it capabilities? Is it accountability? Where should I focus it?
So the first step is to develop insight. It's important to know where to start development. You don't want to waste time developing skills they've already developed or aren't important to their work or their goals.
Yeah, so as Bernie mentioned, you know, the key problem or symptom that you'll see that tells you that there is a problem is that the person is not practicing their exercise. So from the habit perspective, you have worked with a client now to identify what is the 5-minute exercise that they're going to be practicing in the session, outside of the session, and now they come back and you find out that they haven't really practiced. So there is some kind of an issue going on, and your job is now to help diagnose is it a problem of insight or capability or accountability. So when the issue is with insight, generally there's a lack of buy-in. So the person doesn't believe that the exercise is actually something that they have to work on. So they don't believe that they have development need in that particular competency. So you might be faced, maybe the coach or the coachee you're working with has received some negative feedback that they are, they seem like they're believing, but then they don't believe deep inside. Or maybe you were hired as a coach to change some particular behavior. The person just doesn't believe that they need to change. So, of course, we cannot just tell people that, hey, this is your weakness and you need to change it. It doesn't work like that. If it worked like that, then, we wouldn't be necessarily in job. We wouldn't have jobs as coaches. And then also, people, there wouldn't be such a thing as addiction, because you could just simply tell, a cocaine addict that, hey, you're addicted, it's bad for you and you need to stop. So it just doesn't work like that. People have to, in order to really create deep insight, people have to experience that insight themselves. So you as a coach, what you can do is design an intervention that helps the person experience firsthand that this is a problem area for them. And the most effective way to do that is through some kind of a stretch assignment. So you give them an assignment that pushes them in that particular area strong enough where they fail or they almost fail. But through this experience, they realize that they're not as good at that particular skill as they thought they were. Example, if maybe the person is not really good at influencing others, but they really don't believe it. So you can design some kind of a stretch assignment where they have to influence somebody or they have to create buy-in on a project. But until they experience that failure themselves internally, they're not going to get that insight. So that's one way. The other way that is more scalable is to use simulation. So of course, failure is best when it's experienced in the real world, because then you have consequences in the real world that create that insight and that aha moment. But if sometimes it's just too expensive and you cannot do that, or you need to scale that across the organization. So in that case, we find that simulations are the next best thing, where you can actually put the person in a simulated environment and then help them experience this in a real world type of simulation and experience the failure that is going to create that insight. So next we'll move to motivation.
So the initial motivation to change comes from that initial insight, whether it comes from a stretch or a simulation that Martin was talking about just a moment ago. So where does the motivation come from once that experience has subsided? The main symptom here is inconsistent practice after the initial insight experience is worn off. So where's that sustained motivation coming from for your coachee to make sure that they're following through on their developmental goals, throughout your relationship together?
And that's another very, very important part, and especially if we're thinking about turning those leadership behaviors into habits, because the only way we are going to achieve that is through repeated practice, and the person has to be motivated to practice for a minimum of 66 days. So that's about 2 months. So if the person is not motivated to practice and doesn't practice for the 2 months, that one behavior, it never turns into a habit. So oftentimes we see with most leadership development programs is there's this honeymoon period where everybody's very excited and they want to and they have a lot of motivation, maybe because of some insight that they gained, or there's just general hunger for development. But once they realize that this is actually hard work and it requires practice, and it's difficult to sustain that practice. So here, the type of interventions that you can do as a coach, again in the leader habit model, is look for first whether the behavior that the person is trying to adopt, that micro behavior, whether it's really compatible with the person's personality. So in other words, is it consistent with the person's personality, or really are you trying to change something that is very difficult to change? Research on personality shows that it takes an average of 10 years for somebody to change personality. So if you are trying to change a behavior that is really not consistent with the person's personality, then it's not going to be naturally rewarding, and it's not going to, as a result, it's going to be very difficult, very effortful to practice that behavior, and it's going to take longer to turn into a habit, if it even becomes a habit. So here as a coach, you can help the person take a look at the behavior they're practicing and their exercise, and then identify, whether this is really consistent with their personality. So either through a discussion and exploration, is this something that is naturally satisfying? Why? Why not? Do you experience flow when you are practicing this behavior? So in other words, you completely lose track of time. You maybe even forget to eat because it's just so rewarding, and it doesn't take you 5 minutes. It takes you, 30 minutes to engage in that behavior. Or is it something that you are really not wanting to do, and you're pushing yourself really, really hard to do that behavior? You can, of course, do some personality assessments too. So there are assessments that will help you identify whether this behavior is consistent with their personality or not. So that's how you can deal with if the person is stuck in the motivation portion of the pipeline. Now the next one is capabilities, Bernie.
Right. So in the capability, if you're considering the capabilities might be an issue in the pipeline, it might be clogged or constricted here. The question you need to be answering is, do people have the skills and knowledge they need to develop? And in this context, it really has a lot to do with understanding the development process, the 5 minutes a day philosophy. So make sure the skills and knowledge your coaching needs to start development are simple. Teach them the habit formula. They need to be able to practice their new skills and behaviors in realistic situations. So a good coach knows how to break down their skill into smaller parts, as we were talking about before, and build them up through training. So these new skills need to be, practiced in realistic situations where they can really make sure that they have the capabilities to practice those skills. So if your coachee isn't motivated but isn't practicing skills, they may not understand how to develop the skills. That's the issue. So coaches need to understand the development process as well, and what's really going through the pipeline, which, it could be talent, but really the way you can look at it is these habits. These habits are passing through this pipeline. They're being practiced on a regular basis. They're being rewarded appropriately. Coaches have the opportunity to practice, and they're being held accountable. And once this pipeline is completely opened up, they understand what's going on. We can get into more of these, that keystone habit that Martin was talking about a little bit earlier. So make sure that your coaches understand how to form leader habits is the main point. That is another reason your coaching might not be seeing results is because they haven't integrated them into their everyday work. So what we're looking at here in the habit model is identifying cues in the workplace that specify when to start performing your new behavior. So if your coachee isn't practicing outside of coaching sessions, they probably don't know when to perform the micro behaviors on the job. So help them identify cues in the workplace to start performing those behaviors and developing those habits. Make sure, as you've been going through the pipeline and identifying possible issues and kind of building up these leadership habit formulas, make sure that this is aligned with their motivation, their intrinsic motivation, their personality, and that it's simple enough for them to perform. The cues might not be embedded in their workplace, or they might not be salient enough. So good cues should be at the end of another task that they completed. So they're sort of almost asking themselves what to do next. But once you build that habit, they'll know what they'll do. They'll perform the habitual behavior next automatically. So good cues should be at the end of another task and should be very simple to make sure that they remember and notice them. So you want to help people determine how to put the small changes into practice every day, work with people to create personal strategies for assessing what's working well and what they need to do differently, and identify those specific situations where the change is appropriate, those cues in the habit building formula. So once you've reached the end of the pipeline, the development period, and if you don't have a measurable result demonstrating your coachee's progress, you can't prove your worth. Your coachees need accountability so they can see their own progress, and that'll feed back into the insight side of the pipeline. They can see their own progress, they'll understand their needs, and it will continue feeding through habits into talent development. So each part of this pipeline is important to keep the talent development flowing. So the main symptom here is if you don't have a measurement of progress to really establish whether or not these habits are being formed, your coaches are developing their talent like they need to be or they want to be doing. So this is important to assess where, at this accountability phase, this feeds, if you don't have accountability, it makes it a little bit more difficult to identify which of these other pipelines might need attention, if that makes sense. So you can track mechanisms of progress and, track their improvements, and really, you want to be getting consistent feedback and making sure that your coachees are understanding what they're doing right and what they're doing, when they need to be doing these behaviors, these micro behaviors to create their new leader habits. Okay.
So as far as accountability goes, and thank you, Bernie, for that. So the most important and probably the most difficult part about this pipeline and change of behavior is tracking that change and being able to tell whether the person is practicing and if they are in fact improving. So there are, there are some technology solutions that you can actually apply. There's a whole set of apps that you can use that help you and the person to track progress and log practice. So that every day a person is practicing the behavior, they are logging that behavior in, so you can actually review that. But then also it's important to measure improvement. So having an assessment program where you test people in the beginning, so when you start the coaching engagement, and then 6 months in, 12 months in, allows you to actually show the progress. And then with that, you are also creating accountability when the participant knows that they are going to be retested, and we'll be measuring their improvement in these leadership skills. So Bernie, we have about 10 minutes left, so I suggest we go to questions and then close.
All right, that sounds good. Some of our concluding thoughts, just to wrap up what we were talking today, the takeaways that you need to break down your leadership competencies into micro behaviors or leader habits. And then as a coach, your goal is to be building up leadership, positive leader habits, so you can develop talent through the pipeline. So do we have any questions about coaching the leader habits?
If you do have questions, again, remember to post them into the questions box or the chat box. So maybe we'll give people some minute, and I see that there are some questions that people are posting throughout. Can you read them off, Bernie, please?
Yes. So how can coaches track coachee progress? We were just touching on this a little bit. But I guess a little more detail on that would be helpful.
Yeah. So tracking. Do you want to answer this, or do you want me to answer this, Bernie?
I mean, sure. So as far as tracking progress, as Martin was just saying, if you plan an assessment at the beginning of the coaching relationship and you plan an assessment at the end, that's going to be a major indicator of progress at the beginning and end. Now, throughout, you want to be working with some sort of plan to track regular practice of these behaviors. Make sure that throughout, as time is going on, the motivation is still there. Making sure they understand exactly the leadership, or the leader habit formula, or whether it be that, or you need to make sure that you're helping them integrate their practice of their habits into everyday situations. So some sort of, there are leadership development apps out there that might integrate these kinds of things into it. And Pinsight's actually working to develop a new development module as well, which will do something, pretty much this is what we're talking about.
Yeah, so our development module, thank you, Bernie. So the development module that Bernie mentioned that's coming out in a few months here actually helps the person create a development plan through these habits. So it has a lot of resources, like a whole library of these 5-minute exercises, and then it helps the person to track progress and then also measure improvement on a daily basis. So you as a coach, you can actually track, even if you are in between sessions, you could be tracking the person whether they're practicing that behavior, and then also whether they are improving on that behavior or not. And the way we're measuring improvement is actually a very complex algorithm that we have developed based on our research, and it's a combination that's being derived from the practice of the person that they are tracking, but then also once a week we are asking them to send a sample of practice. So maybe they forward an email they wrote, or they take a quick photograph with their phone, or a quick recording with their phone of a conversation, and then forward it to us, where our trained psychologists actually review that, score that, and then based on that we're able to track progress of the individual. Good question. We maybe have time. Yeah, for 2 more questions. I just want to be respectful of everybody's time. Go ahead.
Yeah, there seems to be a good follow-up question, probably from a coach. So that they're talking about, development goals and other aspects of the coaching relationship are often kept confidential. How can you demonstrate value, and what results can you report?
Yeah, this is a very good question, right? So what we can report is you can report a % of change. So you can report the improvement, especially if you're using like a pre-test, post-test method. So let's say that you are, maybe using a simulation-based assessment to measure skills before you start working with the individual, and then after 12 months you measure them again using a simulation, then you compare the pre-test, post-test scores. So when you have a group of coachees, you could easily report the group changes of your client. Even on a one-on-one basis, you could improve the percentage of change, so how much the person has changed, how much they have improved, or you could be reporting things like, are they practicing regularly their exercises on a daily basis? So what percentage of days they have practiced, how many days have they practiced versus no practice. So these are, this habit, leader habit formula gives you many different options for tracking that behavior and improvement.
Okay.
Good. Maybe let's
we've
take
got
one
another
more question.
question.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So what are the best methods or tools that can build insights where coachees actually realize their own needs? So
we covered this. Do you want to review that, Bernie?
Sure. Yeah. So the stretch assignments that are basically great opportunities for your coachees to hopefully really see. Hopefully it'd be a safe assignment where they can determine, where they need to improve, and hopefully it'll build that insight where they see, I wish I could have done this better. If I had the skill developed better, I could have done this better. Sometimes you don't always have that opportunity where you don't have something safe where they can learn, an assignment where they can learn from that kind of an experience. But there are virtual assessment centers and simulations that can really show them, when they go to it and they do their best, they're sitting there trying to handle all of these problems, and it really can be eye-opening and provide a lot of self-insight where people start to understand kind of, okay, other people may not have issues in this area, whereas this is, something I need to be doing better in order to perform better on the actual job. I think we have time for about one more.
Yeah, so, the way to think about it, and thank you, Bernie, for that. So the way to think about it, it's the difference between telling somebody something versus creating a situation where the person gains that insight on their own, right? So when you think about most of the tools that we have and that we use on a daily basis, like personality test, intelligence test, 360-degree reports, those are all based on people telling the person what they think or how they score. So it's all, the person is a passive recipient of that feedback, right? Now that we know from decades of research is that it just creates psychological resistance. People are going to resist them if you tell them some negative feedback. I mean, this is ultimately one of the two reasons why performance management and performance appraisals are failing and organizations are getting rid of them. Because, feedback, if you just tell a person that, hey, this is where you need to change, it doesn't create that level of motivation to change. Think about my example of drug addicts. You could be telling them all day long that what you're doing is harmful and you need to change that behavior, but that's not going to create the motivation or to change. So the distinction here is that the person should not be passive recipient of that information. Rather, they need to actively experience it. And once you make this distinction, this is how you're going to become much more successful at creating insight. So think about what are the assignments, what are the stretch assignments that you can create that allow the person to experience failure and realize themselves that they are just not as good in this skill as they thought. And if you cannot, if the cost of failure would be too high in a stretch assignment, or you want just a bit safer of an environment, the next best thing are simulation assessments and simulations. So now place the person in a fictitious company, in a fictitious role, and then use the simulation environment for them to actively experience what they're good at, what they are bad at. And our research shows that 90% of participants that go through our live leadership simulations are not surprised by the results because they are actively experiencing, they're actively using their leadership skills, and they're actively getting immediate feedback through the way the simulation is set up, where they know if they're doing well or if they're doing poorly in a particular area. So I think with that, we are out of time. So thank you for the questions. They were good questions. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Bernie, any instructions for the survey before we close?
Yes, I was just going to mention the survey. So if you wouldn't mind filling out the survey, letting us know what you thought, and also letting us know if you are looking for HR credits. So that survey will be sent out after we close the webinar here. All right. Thank you for your participation.
With that, yeah. Thank you very much, Bernie. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.